Hello and welcome to the Biz Coach Show, hosted by my Biz Coaches and presented by the TLG Group. Our show is focused on giving entrepreneurs the edge they need to succeed. Let's meet our guest for today's episode. Our guest today is Scott Roney, the principal and attorney at Roney Business Law. For over 30 years, Scott is focused on business, commercial, and transactional law. His specialties include compliance, acquisitions, vendor contracts, and so much more. He's worked with companies across the spectrum from food manufacturing to transportation, real estate, and even healthcare. Learn more at RoneyBusinessLaw.com. Well, hey, Scott, it is great to have you with us today. How are you doing?
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Yeah, doing great. And we're excited to have you here with us. Eric, always great to hang out with you. How are you doing today?
Absolutely. Having a great day, David. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, glad to hear it. Well, Scott, before we dive into our topics for today, and we have a lot of really good stuff on deck here, I'd love to learn just a little bit more about your background and kind of how you got into law and why you kind of chose to specialize in business law specifically.
Sure. So I grew up back in Illinois in a kind of rural area. My mother was a journalist, and she was pretty interested in public affairs, politics, justice, government, things like that. And I guess she kind of passed that on to me. When I was in high school, I developed an interest in those kinds of things, and particularly government and politics, and started thinking about law school, and went into college thinking I was going to go to law school. And you know how it is when you're that age, you start looking at a lot of different things. And I thought about everything from medical school to computer engineering. And looking back, I don't know, computer engineering might have been a wiser move, but ended up coming back to law. I majored in economics, minor in political science, and just decided I wanted to stick with the plan to go to law school, and did that. Went to University of Michigan to law school, and I kind of knew all along I didn't want to do what I call the messy areas of law, things like domestic relations or criminal law. Always wanted to stay on the more commercial corporate side. And when I get into law school, that was kind of confirmed. You do a variety. When you start law school, you do criminal law, you do property, you do constitutional law, and all those things. But I like the business classes. I like the stuff on securities and, corporate and intellectual property and things like that. So yeah, just kind of stuck with me through law school. And when I came out, I went to a firm in Nashville that did a lot of commercial and business type stuff, transactional work. And yeah, kind of rest is history. That's the road I went down.
Awesome. Well, it seems to have worked out well for you. So like you said, maybe not as much as computers with AI and everything now, but either way, it seemed to do pretty good. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have done as well in that area myself. So.
Yeah, you and I both not.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing. And I'm sure just as you've been, working for years, in law, you probably worked with some interesting clients, maybe interacted with some interesting cases. Anything that kind of stands out to you over your career that you'd want to highlight for our audience?
Yeah, I have had some really interesting cases. So I spent 20 years with a large company back in Illinois and did a lot of work around the world. I remember going to Ukraine and doing some investigation of, alleged corruption around international trade issues. And I went to Africa. We had some allegations of child labor in the cocoa supply chain. We were a big cocoa processing company, and sitting down with those folks and trying to figure out what was going on in Africa where they were growing cocoa. And that was interesting. But I think the one matter or the case that stands out the most was a big antitrust case. So I went to the office about 28 years ago. I hate to date myself, but 28 years ago this month, to learn that the FBI had raided our corporate offices overnight and toted off a bunch of computers and documents and spread out around town to interview a number of our executives. And there were allegations of price fixing. And as things unfolded, it turned out that one of our executives was an informant for the FBI and had been wearing a wire and recording conversations and meetings. And the whole thing, of course, just went from there, became a front page story of the Wall Street Journal and several business publications over the next several years. and ultimately a movie. A book first. The Informant was the name of the book by a New York Times journalist, Kurt Eichenwald. Later, a movie by Steven Soderbergh, directed by him, and Matt Damon was a star in the movie. And I remember going to see the movie when it first came out, and I probably knew almost all the characters in the movie. In fact, the lead FBI agent lived just up the street from me. I used to see him walking his dog all the time.
Wow.
And the guy who was the informant, the main character in the movie, I traveled with him. We did deals where I supported him as the business guy, and so that was probably the most memorable case matter I was involved in.
Wow. Yeah.
So I got to ask, how close is the movie to the real story?
Well, in this case, the movie was not all that close. I mean, it was one of these movies where they took a lot of liberty to make it funny. So the book was a serious book, and the book was pretty darn close to the case. But by the time I got to the big screen, it was kind of a goofy movie. Although there were some parts that I remember. In fact, there's one part in the movie where, and so I left out an important detail. The guy who was wearing the wire, that was the informant, he was also in the meantime, at the same time, embezzling $12 million from the company. So he ended up in prison for even more time than the guys who were fixing prices. But I remember at one point, and this is in the movie, one of the other lawyers came into my office and we were holding up papers to the window to look at the signatures to prove that they were forgeries, because they were so perfectly aligned, you could tell they were copied. And that actually happens in the movie. So there were definitely elements of truth in the movie, but I'm sure it was a lot more interesting to me as someone who experienced it firsthand than it would have been to some, random moviegoer.
Right. Well, it's funny because I'm a pretty big movie buff. I love watching movies, and whenever I see when I see it's based on a real story, I'm always intrigued by how much. And having read the books in some cases and then watched the movie, I'm like, there's quite a few variations between the book and the movie. I'm curious to how much variation there's between the real story and the book and the movie.
Well, it reminds me of we used to have a guy who was the head of our PR group at the company. And I remember one time when I was a young lawyer and some article appeared in the press about the company and some decision or something we had done. And I was talking to him about it, and he pulls it out and he says, there's one thing you need to know. Never believe anything you read in the papers, it was one of those deals where then we go through the facts, and the story was way off. And I did experience that a lot as an internal lawyer, knowing what was happening and then reading it in the press and realizing there's very little alignment between the truth and what's being reported. But
so what you're saying is there really is fake news.
Well, there's a lot of false information out there. I'll say that.
I had to go there. Sorry.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing. I think that's the closest we've come to a movie yet on the show. So that's right.
Unfortunately. So at the time, my claim to fame was I was the only one of the 4 lawyers at the company not mentioned by name in the book. So I held that up as a positive thing.
Yeah.
I was going to say, is that a good thing or a bad thing, Scott?
That's awesome. Very cool. Well,
that's cool. Appreciate sharing that story.
Yeah, the backstory, and then that's an interesting highlight for sure. I think as we're talking about that, right? Certainly, certain behaviors in a business lead to higher legal risk, and I think that fits right into our topic for today, which is all about minimizing legal risk, which obviously is something you know a lot about. So I think maybe let's just start, at a broad level, because this is something every business owner should be thinking about, but not every business owner is thinking about. So can you provide a couple examples maybe of common legal risks that small business owners should be aware of?
Sure. So, I mean, an obvious one is just shielding yourself from personal liability for business activities. So, most people know if you form a corporation or an LLC, there are different structures, but basically having that formality in place to shield yourself from certain liabilities that might arise from the business activities is important. And while it seems common sense, probably most people know it theoretically, a lot of people don't do it, or if they do it, they may not observe the formalities that you need to observe by making sure you keep your business activities and financial accounts and things separate from your personal activities. So that's one area that people sometimes stub their toe on. Contractual risks is a big one, and that can run a pretty broad spectrum, everything from your business structure. So even with your structure, like whether it's a corporation or an LLC, typically you need to have in place an agreement that governs the relationships between the people who are involved. So if it's a sole proprietorship, it's pretty straightforward. But if you've got partners, 2 or 3 people forming a business, you want to be sure you got the right agreements in place, whether it's a partnership agreement, operating agreement, shareholder agreement. And I've definitely run into plenty of situations where people did not have those or tried to do it themselves, which is another problem. Obviously, acquisitions, if you're buying a business, again, a lot of contractual issues there, maybe due diligence issues. You want to be sure you've looked under the hood and you know what you're getting. And then even just day-to-day stuff. A lot of people I find don't have contracts in place for their customers or vendors, or they just accept vendor contracts and may not know what they're getting into when they sign those kind of contracts. So contracts is a big area. The tort, I mentioned shielding yourself from personal liabilities. Obviously, if you own a storefront and somebody trips and falls coming in your door, there could be exposures like that. And I would say insurance coverage is usually the most important risk management technique or element there to reduce the risk of that. And then from there, it kind of depends on the business. So if you got employees and you got issues around employment, and that gets bigger the more people you have, and that leads sometimes to tax issues, and often businesses want to treat what may legally be employees as contractors and not pay them like an employee, not withhold the employment taxes, and you got to be careful with that. Depending on the regulatory environment of your business. If you've got a food business, for example, you got a higher regulatory environment, or a financial services business, or cannabis in Arizona, heavily regulated areas that you need to be concerned about the regulations specific to that type of a business. And then things, as you grow particularly, but things like worker safety, if you're in construction or manufacturing, OSHA issues, environmental issues, if you're doing anything with hazardous materials or, creating environmental concerns, consumer protection laws, false advertising, and fair trade type stuff. So I know that's a long list and kind of a gamut, but to a large extent, it depends on the business you're in. But those are some of the common areas that I find businesses maybe haven't dealt with properly or aren't thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's a good list because there's a lot of things in there that people may not immediately associate as a legal risk. So I think it's good to kind of create that broad net and really get people thinking about, man, maybe there are risks in their business that they haven't even considered. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Right.
Yeah. So Scott, I don't know how much we want to get into the minutiae of this, but one of the topics that comes up often with us as business coaches is the legal consideration of an employee, a W-2 employee versus a 1099 contractor,
Right.
and what the guidelines are around that. Very clearly defining what that looks like, and then what extrapolations come from that is like it's interesting as an entrepreneur. There's a natural tendency to let's say, how far can we push this envelope before it becomes an issue?
Right.
So protecting yourself always is smart in that regard.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of small businesses think they can fly under the radar, and they probably do. But you never know if an employee or somebody who you've treated as a contractor decides they're an employee, and they may file a complaint and go to the IRS or the state authorities. You could have an issue because if you haven't withheld the taxes, that's illegal, obviously. And I think there's a lot of abuse or misunderstanding, maybe I should say, of that concept where people just think, well, I can call somebody a 1099 contractor. They say 1099 employee, which doesn't even make sense legally, but I call them a 1099 worker. Just because I call them that doesn't mean they are that, So.
Right. Yeah, good point. And as you say that, it's funny because in my experience, when we have those types of conversations, there's a lot along the line of they take the interpretations, they take the pieces of the interpretation that they're familiar with, and they incorporate it into their logic as to why they think they're right, whether it's a W-2 or a 1099. They incorporate that logic into why they think they're right. And I'm like, yep, there's also another piece or two in here that you're not considering that would be a direct contrary to what you're suggesting justifies your rationale. So it's often my experience, business owners, when they're trying to prove themselves right, they're like, well, this says this and this and this. And I'm like, yes, but there's also this and this that you have to consider. And I don't think that you're doing a good job of that.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit of a complicated area. I mean, unfortunately, like a lot of areas of the law, there's no clear-cut answer. Typically, there's a whole list of factors that you have to consider. But for the most part, if they don't have their own independent business and they aren't, exercising discretion about how they do a job and when they do a job, then they're probably not a contractor.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it's a good transition as we kind of move from, things that people aren't thinking about that they should be. It's probably equally important to think about, areas where a small business owner might understand something incorrectly. Maybe they have a misconception, or maybe, there's a myth that they've kind of clung to. So I'd be curious, in your experience, what are some of those, misconceptions or myths that small business owners have about various legal issues, and how do you address them?
Yeah. So let me address it at a little bit more of a conceptual level, I guess, as opposed to specific legal misunderstandings, because there can be a lot of those. But I guess a couple things for businesses that are smaller, which is more my target audience. A lot of times they think it's too expensive to get a lawyer early on. So, they're doing their initial planning, whether it's structuring or setting up the foundations of their business or whatever. And so they think, well, I'll wait until later, when I've got more money or I can afford it to get a lawyer. And, that's just a mistake in my view. And I guess maybe that sounds self-serving, but I've had to fix a lot of problems for people who try to do it themselves, because of the expense of a lawyer. And I appreciate that. I mean, I understand it's not a small expense often, but I would just say, find somebody that you trust that can give you some advice starting out so that you set things up properly so you don't have to fix it later. One of the other things that people, I think, often think in business is, well, I'll get a lawyer when I need one. And, if somebody sues me, or if I've got some specific legal problem that I need help with, I'll go get a lawyer. And, I like to think of it in terms of, well, you only have an issue once you have an issue. Right. Yeah. So that's not the way to look at it. I mean, a lot of these issues can be prevented or headed off if you get some good advice before the issue surfaces or before you already have a problem. And the other thing, and this one's a little bit hard, and it kind of cuts across all sizes of business, but this idea that because I'm right, I should fight. So I'm sure I did the right thing. I didn't break the law. I would win if we go to court. So we're not going to pay him a dime, type thing. You get that a lot. And, one of the things I try to make business owners understand is how distracting it can be to deal with a legal problem. You get sued, you're in depositions, you got discovery. It's very distracting to the person trying to run a business during the day. And then they got a lawyer calling them and asking them to provide information, gather documents, answer questions, review letters, whatever it is. And the expense adds up too, obviously. So, somebody comes into me with a $10,000 problem, somebody's threatening to sue them over $10,000 or something. My first attack is, look, this is not worth A, hiring a lawyer probably, and B, going to court over for sure. So let's take an early look at how you can get this resolved in a reasonable manner and move on and focus on your business, as opposed to spend the next year fighting over $10,000, So those are a few of the, I think, myths that or misconceptions that I encounter that you have to try and quickly deal with in the kind of the mindset of a business owner.
Yeah. As I was going to say, as you're even saying that last part there, the $10,000 challenge, right? They're processing, and I'm like, yeah, well, you're going to retain a lawyer for at minimum $3,000 or $4,000 likely. I'm like, yeah, 40% to save the
Right.
At some point, it just doesn't make sense logically. But there's to your point that I'm right, so I'm going to fight mentality. I've tried to coach owners away from that. I'm like, I don't think this is. I'm like, I'm not going to make you legal advice here, but I would strongly encourage you to consider other options because it doesn't seem to me like this is a winnable scenario in any situation. So let's talk to a lawyer. Right, to your point, it's even challenging sometimes to get them to engage with a lawyer, which is an interesting point I want to bring up because I know you have a different strategy on how you provide your services. So I want to give some opportunity to talk about that. But that's that idea of, I can afford a lawyer and then they wait till the last minute and now it's going to cost substantially more. There's a lot in you understanding as a lawyer coming in externally, you don't know much about the business. You have to understand how the business operates, how these circumstances came about to be able to help defend them or whatever the case may be, right? Or take that role. But there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for, where you uncovering, some of the stuff that needs to be uncovered. There's a lot that causes more of a cost and more of a engagement. And to your point, so much more distraction to the business. I've been through a couple of big wrongful termination lawsuits, and man, they just suck the energy out of the room with the sales organization and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and that last point is one of the things I try to emphasize, and I certainly experienced this in my corporate life. And the case that we talked about, and kind of laughed about, that became a movie. I mean, that's one of the biggest examples I've ever seen where a significant portion of the senior leadership of the company, and we're talking Fortune 100 company, was extremely distracted for years on that matter. And you take a small business that maybe has one person running it or a handful of people, and you suddenly take a big chunk of their time away from focusing on the business to dealing with some legal problem. That's a big hit to the business. It's hard to keep the business going and stay focused on what you're trying to do when you're dealing with that, and it is draining.
Yeah, agreed.
Absolutely. Well, as you're working with clients, especially as an attorney specializing in business law, how do you go about counseling your clients on these various legal issues, which can really run the gamut as you've outlined for us, but really kind of focusing on practical risk-based approach?
Yeah, and I mean, I think coming from my background where I was in-house and dealt with business leaders on a constant basis, I learned over the years that you have to give them practical answers. You have to help them solve the problems, not just tell them what the law is and then kind of force them to figure out what to do from there. You really got to help walk them through it. And so, I think a lot of lawyers have a reputation for not really giving answers, not giving direction. And they, as professionals, we understand the client is the decision maker ultimately. So we're not going to tell you, here's what you have to do. But at the same time, clients want you to give them some options and some practical advice and say, well, here's 3 options. You do this, here's what might happen. You do this, here's what might happen. And I mean, I'm not reluctant to say, look, if I were in your shoes, here's what I would do. At the end of the day, it's their decision. But I think, a lot of lawyers don't give those kinds of practical answers, but just identify the problem and then kind of throw it back to the client. So I think that's one thing that's really important, particularly in the business setting. And so, you want to help them make good decisions, trying to understand their own priorities, their own risk tolerance. But if you really spend time with them and understand where they're coming from, I find generally you can give them a pretty good idea what they really should do. And, at the end of the day, they decide. But so, and then prioritizing, we talked about preventing problems. Well, you can't prevent every legal problem, right? So let's be realistic. So helping them to look at legal risk from a prioritization standpoint, I think is really important, and making them realize if you've got 100 employees, okay, employment compliance and employment issues is probably a significant risk for you. And that may depend on whether it's a professional environment or more of a manufacturing environment, and what kind of hierarchy you have, levels. But maybe that's something they need to take a look at. Maybe they need to implement employee handbook or some sort of policy around discrimination and harassment, and do some training, things like that, to prevent that problem. But you got 2 employees, well, then maybe that's not such a significant issue. So prioritizing, look at the particular business environment they're in, and where there may be higher risk, so that they don't think you're just coming in and trying to tell them every potential legal, thing that could happen ever. And all these, lawyers like to do that, right? They like to throw out, well, somebody paid $10 million last year because they did XYZ. So you guys should be thinking about this. Well, that may or may not be relevant to the business that you're advising. So helping them to see it from a practical, prioritized point of view. And then again, on the practical side also is the mitigation piece. So what's reasonable for them to do? I mean, should they take 25 steps that may be the perfect solution? If you do all 25 of these things, you're probably going to never have a problem. Or if you do, you've got a great defense. But is that reasonable in their business environment? Are there 3 things they could do that would reduce the risk 80%, and so being attuned to that and what their resources are and what's reasonable for them. I've heard people refer to the legal department or lawyers as the department of no. They always tell you, no, you can't do things. So don't go ask the lawyers, because they're going to tell you can't do it.
I think that's where the term ask for forgiveness rather than permission came from.
Exactly. In fact, that was a thing our former CEO at the company I was at liked to quote. So it doesn't always work that very well. But I was attuned to that in the sense that I did not want to be perceived that way. I mean, I wanted to be the person they felt comfortable going to, that would tell them no if I really had to. I mean, if it was one of these situations where I'm saying, hey, you're going to be in violation of the law if you do that. Or more often, I wanted to be the person who would work with them to figure out, well, how do we do it to minimize the chance that we're going to have a legal problem, that we're going to cross the line? How do we structure this in a way that is defensible or is within, the parameters of the law and regulations? So I think that's important. And trying to overcome that perception as a lawyer is a challenge. And lastly, and kind of all this maybe is packaged in this a little bit, I want my clients to see me as a partner with them, not somebody who, hey, I've got a contract I need reviewed. Can you give me your comments on this contract, or can you draft this or whatever? But really somebody who walks alongside them as they grow their business, as they try to figure out the best strategies to move ahead and reduce legal risk. Somebody they can call up and, on a Friday afternoon like today, right, and say, hey, this issue just came up. I don't know if I need, to do anything, or if I need legal advice, but I'm a little concerned. Can you tell me, what you think? Do we need to have a longer conversation? Do you need to dig into this, or is this not a concern? So I want them to see me as somebody who helps them succeed in their business. So that's really, I guess, the key approach that I take, and I'm sure there are other lawyers that do, but I'm not sure too many lawyers have that reputation of being seen as a true business partner, trying to help you succeed as the owner or executive. But that's important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and to business owners too, right? They really want to feel like they have a partner. So I think that resonates.
Right. And the clients I have that I think I've built that kind of relationship with, I think they've benefited greatly, and they would say that they really appreciate having that relationship with their lawyer, that it's not just twice a year I call them up because I got something I got to call them for, but really on an ongoing basis, we talk about things and what I'm thinking about in terms of my future business or growth, and what new issues that might raise, and how to do it most effectively to prevent risk.
Yeah, you probably don't want to only get called when it's, hey, I got sued again, right?
Right. No, in fact, I'd rather not get called at all like that. But I mean, Eric's probably heard me say this, but a common phrase I use is, I want to be the lawyer who keeps you out of trouble, not gets you out of trouble.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Well, I think, kind of on that vein, as you were talking about prioritizing legal risk, I'm kind of curious, are there any specific strategies that you utilize with a client to kind of help identify and prioritize those legal risks in their business?
Yeah, ideally, I have a fairly in-depth conversation with them about their business, where they are today, where they're going. So we want to look at their basic structure. Do they have in place the right organizational structure now? Are they utilizing that effectively? If they're going to be growing, does that need to change? Do they need to have a subsidiary company to, if they're going to acquire a new business, things like that? What do they do? Obviously, from an operational point of view, it's a lot different if you're manufacturing missiles for the government than it is if you're making some piece of plastic that's for a toy or something. And they each have their own issues, don't get me wrong, but you can have a very different legal risk environment depending on the type of operations you have, the product you're producing, the services. And I mentioned missiles. I mean, government contracting comes with its own whole scope of issues legally, as far as what you have to do to be a government contractor and the kind of certifications you're making and compliance programs. So if you're a government contractor, that raises a lot of issues and questions. Size and scope, generally, I've already talked about employees. So the more employees you get, the more risk you get in that area. And it can be taxes, as well as obviously the basic employment issues. The volume of business you're doing, if you're doing interstate commerce versus international commerce, whole new realm of issues opens up if you're exporting or importing. The physical situation, do you have physical properties that people come into? Do you have manufacturing facilities where people are working and maybe you got safety issues? And then the regulatory environment on specific areas, whether it's food or medical or cannabis or there are lots of areas that have higher regulatory scrutiny. And then what's their history of issues? Are they already under the microscope? Do they have a agreement or a settlement with a government agency where they're being monitored or looked at? So kind of walking through all of that, David, and talking to them about, where are you? What's your environment like? What are you doing? And what kind of issues does that raise? And then, coming up with a list based on that to say, here's what I think are the most important areas or where you're most exposed, and then talking through with them how to prioritize that, and being, again, attuned to their own tolerance for risk, because some business owners are willing to run a lot more risks than others, right? Some are very risk averse. I don't want anything to happen. I don't want to ever have accusation of being conducting business illegally or being beyond the law. Others are more like, hey, we got to take some risks to make money. So tell me what the situation is, but here's where I want to be. And, if I think it's too close to the edge, I'll tell them that. But again, at the end of the day, that's their decision.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I think as you're kind of talking through this, I'm getting a good picture of kind of how you're working with, these various clients. You're identifying these legal risks. And I think really at that point, you start getting into needing to take some action, whether that's mitigating the risk that you've prioritized and identified, but also compliance. So can we talk just a little bit more about that, kind of the mitigation process, or how you help your clients become more compliant, and what are some of the most effective methods to do that?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of years as a compliance officer for a global company and was pretty involved in professional circles around developing good practices and compliance programs and what have you. So I take those same principles that apply to big business and, bring them to all businesses, really small and medium-sized businesses, and try to fit them to their particular situation and what the risks are that they have and how significant they are. So, but to talk about just some of the basic areas you want to be looking at. Number one, I think maybe most importantly, is culture and expectations of management. I mean, have they set the right tone in terms of how they want to do business, establish the right values to tell their employees, here's our expectations, and do they understand that that's how they are to conduct the business? And it seems pretty straightforward, but I've seen time and again that employees feel pressure to make money, to do sales, to get things done, And they sometimes, if they don't have the right foundation built, they interpret that as do whatever it takes. I mean, if that means I got to fudge some numbers, if that means I got to, push some inventory in somewhere it doesn't belong, or sales into last month when they really were this month, that's what they do. And then afterward, manager's like, well, why would you do that? And, they don't understand the culture that they've established or the pressures that may be causing incentives they don't intend. So that's one thing. Education, obviously. So making sure people who are in positions where they could create a problem, they understand, how not to. I mean, they understand where the line is, what the issues are legally, and how to make sure they're staying within those parameters. And that may include policies and procedures. I mean, I'm not somebody who wants to dump a lot of policies and documentation and say, oh, it's good because now we got this big book of, policies on the shelf, and so we're covered. That's not my mentality. But at the same time, you do sometimes need policies and procedures, particularly for sensitive things that maybe, if people don't have a good framework to do it every time the same way, things can get kind of out of control, or they can get off off the reservation. So, and training goes along with that. A lot of times, if you can have those policies and procedures, but if you don't train people on them and make sure they understand how they work and when they need to ask the questions, that can be a problem. And then audits and reviews. So again, depending on the size of the business and complexity, there are areas where it's important to do regular reviews, whether it's internal auditors or just have your lawyer or your accountant take a look at things and make sure everything looks like it's in order and things are happening the way you expect them to happen. And then, it is important, I think, even for smaller businesses to have a process in place where employees, if they see something that they think is a problem, they can go to somebody. And it may be the CEO or the owner, or it may be a lawyer, or maybe a board member, or I don't know, it could be some designated person otherwise, but a mechanism where they know, hey, I just saw this person harassing my coworker. Who do I talk to? I mean, how do I raise that as an issue to be addressed? So, I mean, those are some of the standard steps or, process steps you look at to make sure the right compliance elements are in place.
Awesome. Yeah, Eric, I saw you were smiling a little bit on the sales pressure. Did you you want to chime in? I know we both seen
no
flashbacks
at all, none whatsoever. Yeah, we had that at our previous organization, Scott. We actually had a what we called our integrity team, and they were there for lack of a better term, compliance. Right? We were a reseller for a wireless carrier, and in the early days of the industry, and I don't want to throw any companies under the bus, but in the early days of the wireless industry, client data was not a priority. Maintaining, security under client data, was not a priority. And I'm talking like 25 years ago, right? It was we didn't think about it back then. And over the years, progressively, more things would transpire, which would then lead to more creative sales practices, which would lead to more compliance concerns, which would lead to more creative sales practices.
Right.
And it was like, there was a joke. I literally made a joke one time, and it wasn't really a funny joke, but it was, but it wasn't. It was, we had salespeople who were really good, very successful salespeople. And we would have to terminate them for integrity issues, right? Reaching levels of integrity that we weren't acceptable, right? And what was ironic about it is that many times their level of what they did from a percentage of the overall volume was really like 5 or 10% of their transactions.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like they were, like if you had a representative that was making $80,000 or $100,000 a year, you'd be like, wait a minute, this is a lot of money. This is like twice what the average person might make, right? And you're like, there's got to be something funny. We dig in and we look at it, and when we did find somebody who was doing something that was egregious, we dig in and we look at it and we're like, actually, ironically, only about 5 or 10% of their business was wrong, bad. It was literally, and the reason that they did it was they felt compelled because they wanted to be number one. because we put so much emphasis on being number one. It wasn't about making more money. Is that they wanted to be the top sales rep, or they wanted to be the top cat, whatever, right? And that was the pressure to perform, which in some cases was also, those are usually the underperformers. And they would find the tactics that were inappropriate and they would employ them to get over the line so they keep their jobs, so to speak.
Right.
Not that we ran everybody off, but there was that pressure to perform was there, to your point. And consequently, they would do these types of things. And it was like, I literally got to a point in my career, and I'm going to say it's the better part of the last 6 or 8 years in the industry, that it was like the only people I let go were people that were doing in poor practice, integrity breaches, basically is what it came down to.
Yeah.
I don't hardly let anybody go for performance issues and things like that. It literally it was like we felt like we're more like police officers than anything.
Yeah.
So that's the ugly side of pushing for the top performing, and expecting those performance levels. And I think there's a unique balance to that as well, right? How do you not expose yourself when you creating a compensation plan is something I'll openly have conversation with clients. And I'm like, so you want to make it so that they're pushing, but you don't want to make it so you're encouraging them to do something that would cause them to go past that threshold, right? And do something that they don't.
Yeah,
So,
it's a challenge. It's a challenge to put in place an appropriate incentive comp program that does give people, motivation to do what you want done, but at the same time doesn't motivate them to cross that line or has some sort of guardrail so that they know not to. But yeah, I think, that's been an interesting conversation in bigger business. And I think as businesses grow and they start looking at those kinds of comp programs is an important consideration. How do you ensure that you're building in the right protections and not incenting stuff that you don't want incented,
Right.
So.
Well, and you mentioned it earlier, culturally, how are you enforcing or suppressing, that kind of an activity? I mean, I literally, as we're talking through this, even on a much bigger scale, was the big debacle that it had at Wells Fargo a couple of years back.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And all the major players that were, removed from that organization based on poor practices that they were doing. And again, culturally, it was being led, not encouraged directly, but indirectly, right? By the pressure to perform, they were doing things that you wouldn't want people to do with bank accounts. So,
right. Yeah. And there's a lot of that. I mean, you commented about, firing people or letting people go. Certainly that's a powerful message. If a performer, somebody who's doing well or is, performed well, but they cross the line, if they get fired, that's an important cultural message in and of itself. But I do see, unfortunately, all the time, the other side of the coin. You can probably name a lot of CEOs who are sitting there making millions and millions of dollars a year, who've overseen the organization through some pretty serious legal problems and big bills in terms of fines and legal fees that, they just go on as though nothing ever happened. So.
Yeah, agreed. That's a whole nother gamut of that conversation.
Right. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Scott, as we've been talking, I've been kind of thinking about this from the perspective of somebody that may be listening or watching, and let's say they're a small business owner and they're understanding, hey, there is some legal risk. I probably need to engage some legal counsel, but they're worried about kind of what you mentioned at the beginning is the cost aspect of this. So, what are some kind of tips or strategies or advice you have for somebody that maybe wants to get some general legal counsel? They want it affordably, but they also want to make sure it's quality counsel. Like, how do they balance all of that?
Mm-hmm. Contact me.
There you go.
No, I'm being facetious, even though I, certainly would like to help them if I can. But, you do want to find a lawyer who's going to be in the game with you, I think, for the long term. You don't want somebody who's just coming in for a transaction with you, or that, is just coming in to pay, get a bill paid. But you want somebody who's interested in building a relationship with you, understanding your business, where you're going, what your risk, perspective is, and that you can trust to take care of things, once decisions have been made and you're given direction. So back to my point about the distraction, I want to be the lawyer who they trust is going to handle it once they give direction and say, here's what I want to do with this, or here's how I'd like to get this resolved, they know you're going to run with it and take care of it for them. And so, I think if you can find somebody like that, that's a great start. If you're not sure if you need to involve a lawyer, I would say involve a lawyer. So, I mean, if it's one of those where you're on the fence, maybe I need to call a lawyer. I don't know. You better call a lawyer, and find out if it's something that you need help with. And I mean, if they're professional and they're a good lawyer, I would certainly do this. I'll tell people, look, you don't need me for this, write them a letter, tell them you're not going to pay or whatever it is. You don't need me, to pay me to do something like that. And that kind of goes to what I mentioned earlier about DIY, do it yourself legal matters. So there are some things that you can handle on your own. And I will tell you that, but there are a lot of things people try to handle on their own. I mean, if you're going to LegalZoom and you're finding an agreement or a document, and then you're going to adapt it to something, don't do that. I mean, you're going to create a problem. I can almost guarantee you if you try to be your own lawyer in that way. So back to earlier comments about, spend a little money. I mean, spend a little effort, have it done properly so that you don't create a problem in the future. Cause I've seen some pretty significant problems where people, could have spent $1,000, to set something up right. And now they're spending $10,000 or $20,000 to unwind it. And, because it's such a mess. And then again, echoing on one of my earlier comments, don't underestimate the headache, the hassle, the distraction that a legal problem is going to create for you. So, I think people, they just think of it in terms of, well, I might lose this case or I might have to pay a lawyer, but there's a lot more cost in a less tangible way to dealing with a legal problem, and most of it being the distraction to you and your team sometimes for that. So, I just, I guess it's not surprising coming from the lawyer, right? But I'm a big believer that smaller businesses should try and have a resource like almost all big businesses do, where they have a relationship with a lawyer or group of lawyers that they can rely on, they can go to when they need to, and they trust them to give them good advice. I mean, every large company has a legal department, sometimes with hundreds, if not thousands of lawyers that their business leaders can go to anytime they want. And they know they can get answers and good help and support. And a lot of small or even medium-sized businesses don't have that. So that's a niche I'm hoping to try and help fill, or a gap I'm trying to fill, is helping those businesses have access to quality legal counsel they can trust, and that's going to help them be successful. I mean, it's hard enough competing against big business when you're smaller as it is, let alone without, having those kinds of legal hurdles that you can't work through, or you don't have the good resources to work through.
Yeah. Yeah. And Scott, I will say as an endorsement, the concept that you propose is the fractional general counsel, that kind of role, right? The logic behind that is pretty solid. I mean, even as a business coach, one of the things that we encourage our clients to understand is that, as a coach, there's a generalist, so we can advise, right, and offer suggestions in certain areas of your business, but there becomes a point where, like, okay, I can get you to here, but now we're getting into, a really deep accounting scenario or some kind of legal scenario or something like that. And then we make those recommendations. But to your point, there are a number of clients that are big enough that could totally justify the value of having the ability to pick up the phone and call someone like yourself and say, hey, walk me through this. I guess I need some guidance, right? And here's where I'm at. Here's the circumstances, situations. But just being able to pick up that phone and know that they can make that call and have that conversation. And you and I joked about this one of the first times we met, with the idea that, you're the kind of lawyer I can sit and have a beer with, and we can talk about it. That might be appropriate, but but the idea that we can go out and have a beer and talk about things, but more specifically, you're not stuffy. You're a very approachable person, right? It's not you're stuffy and quite honestly, we could have good conversation and as to retain you as a fractional general counsel, having the ability to just pick up the phone, have that conversation, have you give me some suggestions, and then know I can move forward and feel confident about the decision moving forward, that there's a lot of value in that. And I have clients that I'm like, you really need to consider this, because this is going to make your life easier, rather than feeling like you're like stuck between a rock and a hard place and you're afraid to make that phone call. And that's, I've been there, right? When I had my trucking business, that was there was multiple times where you'd get these types of letters and you're like, I'm not exactly sure what this means, but I need to dig into it. And then I know that if I call a lawyer, I'm looking at, $350, $450 an hour or whatever that is. And, how do you go about, but having had a solution like that at that time would have been super valuable to me as a business owner at that time. Yeah, so I appreciate that. I just acknowledge that because I think it's a really interesting approach. And I think it's very valuable to that target audience that you're trying to approach.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Eric. And, I try to make myself approachable. I've learned over the years that even though as a lawyer, you tend to, just think of yourself as like everybody else, right? And you lose sight of the fact that people are often intimidated by lawyers, and
yes,
and a lot
absolutely.
of times they don't feel comfortable talking to a lawyer. And I don't, I wish that wasn't the case, but I try to go out of my way to make myself approachable and seem like I'm, sort of just a person just like them. I mean, and
Right.
concerned about their business as much as they are. And so I hope that's the way it comes across. But yeah, the fractional general counsel concept, I think, is a really good concept for smaller businesses that don't need a full-time lawyer. And for somebody like me as the counselor, if I'm regularly involved in their business and I know what's going on, it's a lot easier for me to jump into something quickly and deal with it or help them with it than if I gotta all of a sudden spend, several hours coming up to speed on, well, what is your business? What's the
Right.
background here? Yeah. So I think there is some real benefit in that concept for businesses if they've gotten to that point of, kind of magnitude where they have regular legal issues coming up. I think it's a great way to go.
And I would even go so far as to suggest it doesn't even necessarily need to be a legal issue per se, but it's like, legally, where are the guidelines here that I need to make sure that I'm not crossing those boundaries, right? I mean, it's even just a consideration. It doesn't even need to be an actual legal. I think that's where my clients get caught up. They're like, well, do I need a lawyer? And I'm like, if you're asked, just like you just said, if you're asking the question, you should probably talk to a lawyer, because then you get the guidance. And if, as long as you have a quality lawyer that you're talking to your point, you're like, yeah, you don't really need me for this. Just submit this letter, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And you'll be fine. Whereas, and to your point earlier about, like partnership agreements, this is one of the rubs that I have as a coach with clients that don't take the time to structure good operating agreements and partnership agreements and all that kind of stuff. They're like, we'll worry about that when we're bigger. Well, it's also a much bigger problem and more costly problem when you wait till you're bigger, right? And that creates even more. And to your point, you should have spent $1,000. Now you're unwinding it for $20,000. I mean, it's right. Sometimes we find ourselves, and we're entrepreneurs, right? We're doing bootstrapping our business, and you're like, well, I don't have the extra money. Well, if you don't have it now, it's not going to be any easier later, and it's going to be a lot more costly or more going to require a lot more effort and all those types of things. So.
Right. Yeah. And your reaction is actually instructive to me, Eric, because it reminds me that when I use the term legal issues, it often means something different than what a business owner or somebody with a business mindset thinks, because they're thinking of it as, well, somebody's going to sue me, or I've got a letter from the government, saying I'm out of compliance or something. When I use the term legal issues, I mean it much more broadly to just, hey, if you, are structuring a transaction, or you're thinking about how to ensure I don't have a compliance issue in this particular area of my business. To me, those are all legal issues. So yeah, your point's fair. I mean, there are businesses that are of the size or magnitude, they're small enough, they probably don't need a lawyer on a routine basis, and the fractional general counsel concept is probably not right for them. But yeah, once you start having a decent sized business, I mean, a business that's really doing a regular flow of activities, whether it's services or producing products, you're going to start running into legal questions on a pretty routine basis.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and people, right? I mean, just people in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That to your point earlier, that already begins to open that door of opportunity.
Right.
To have problems.
Right. Yeah, I actually want to dive a little bit deeper into that, Scott, because we're talking about affordability, right? That fractional general counsel is just one of the rate structures that you have available, through your firm. So do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the other ways somebody might go about engaging you or other legal counsel, but probably you, right? Because you're here.
Yeah, well, as everybody probably knows, the traditional legal approach to legal billing in the business world, at least in business lawyers, is hourly billing, right? So you just pay by the hour depending on how long it takes. And I mean, for example, kind of a standard rule of thumb in the legal business is if you're doing a contract, you can assume it's going to take you about 3 hours a page to do a contract, so you get a 10-page contract, 30 hours, my standard rate's $450 an hour. I mean, that's a lot of money, right? So to do a 10-page contract. Now, not every contract's going to take that much time if you got standard stuff that you're just pulling out and what have you. But it takes more time than people would expect to review and put together a contract. And even if you're starting with a template, you got to tailor it to the specifics of this situation and what have you. So anyway, hourly billing is obviously something I do. And there are a lot of situations where it's hard to estimate how much time it's going to cost on the front end or how much time it's going to take to get something done. So sometimes that's just what you got to do. Flat fee is another alternative, and that's not too uncommon, where you can kind of identify, okay, this is going to take me approximately X hours, so that the client knows it's not going to go over X dollars. I'll give them a flat fee, say $1,000 to do this. Usually you build in a little cushion, right? Because you're not sure if it's going to take me 3 or 5 hours, and what else might come up, and maybe it ends up taking more. So you're going to quote it on the little bit higher end, probably, so that you're sure you don't end up losing your shirt or spend a lot of time that you don't get paid for. But the other approach, and the one I really like, is this fractional general counsel flat fee approach. And a lot of people confuse that with a retainer. So a retainer technically is you make a deposit. Basically, you give me, let's say, a $10,000 retainer. Well, then I bill against it as I spend time on your matter. And once I've spent enough time that it takes up the $10,000, I want another retainer. I want more money. So it's really just a deposit to make sure you're going to pay. Whereas the flat fee, the monthly flat fee, and I would use this in the fractional general counsel approach that Eric's talking about, is a flat fee. I mean, you pay me, I'm just going to make up numbers here, but let's say you pay me $2,000 a month to offer you a scope of services on an ongoing basis every month. And I perform those services, for that amount. And it's just a flat earned fee when it's billed. I'm not billing against it hourly. So those are all three options that I offer. And going in, I meet with the client and talk to them. And if the monthly flat fee doesn't make sense for them, obviously I'll tell them that. And I'll do my best to work with them if they are concerned about cost to try to get something done economically. But, there are limits. Obviously, we all got to make money. So.
Yep. Awesome. Well, I think as we kind of come down the home stretch here, I'd be curious, just, reflecting back on some of the clients that you've worked with, are there any maybe particular approaches or strategies or initiatives or solutions that you've kind of come up with to address some of those critical risk areas within some of your clients' businesses?
Yeah. I mean, again, it really goes back to that evaluation when you first meet with the client and try to understand their business. And it can be anything from, the stuff I've talked about, putting in place a policy, doing some training, maybe just laying out a particular procedure for how to make sure employees do something the same way every time to ensure they check the boxes with some compliance regulation, like quality, if it's a food manufacturing facility, which I've had a lot of experience with food manufacturing. So just making sure they're going through each step of the process the same every time to make sure you produce the same quality of product and that it's safe and good. So I mean, it's a little bit hard to answer in a broad sense, but theoretical sense, but I think just looking at those kinds of things, and a lot of it does come down to setting the right culture, making sure people understand if you want them to operate with integrity and within the bounds of the law, that they know that, and that that's a top priority. That, yeah, you may be paying them to get more sales, but that doesn't trump that foundational element of doing it the right way. Making sure they have the right education, so they understand what the risks are, where the lines are. And then if it's a more complicated process, making sure there's a process or procedure document, or training on it in place to make sure that they're following that. So I don't know if that's responding to your question very well, David, but it just, you really have to tailor it to the risk situation and the business situation. But those are some of the standard things you look at.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I guess before we jump into maybe some key points and action items that I'll recap here in a minute, you obviously got extensive experience in this realm. So any kind of final advice that you would give a small business owner regarding legal matters, and really maybe some advice that can help them focus on their core business activities instead of those, distractions that could come up, when legal things arise?
Yeah, and I hate to be repetitive, but again, I think this concept of finding a legal counsel who's in the game with you, in the sense of being your partner, is concerned about your success, and it doesn't see it as just a transactional approach, I think is really critical. If you have somebody like that, I think you're going to get comfortable calling them, even when you're not sure you need to call them, and you're not going to expect a bill for 0.2 of an hour next month because I made a 3-minute phone call, to ask them a quick question and say, hey, do I need a lawyer on this? And now you get a $500 bill or something. So I think that relationship with the right lawyer, and I would just say, if you get somebody, either you engage them or you just meet with them to talk to them about being your lawyer or your counsel, and you're not comfortable with that, then don't engage them. I mean, there are other lawyers out there that you can go to. So make sure you find the right person who fits for you. And don't let them intimidate you. I find so many lawyers that are just so, I don't know, just very formalistic in the way that they engage with a client initially. Well, fill out this form, send me $2,000 as a retainer and sign this engagement letter, and then I'll meet with you and we'll talk about things. Don't do that. I mean, that's not my approach. And I think any lawyer who understands, advising businesses understands that's not the way to start out. Now, if you're a litigator and they got a lawsuit and you're gonna answer a lawsuit and stuff, that's a whole different game. But if you want to truly be their business partner, I mean, you want to help them on an ongoing basis as an advisor in connection with their business, that's not the right approach.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, before we kind of wrap up and hear a little bit more about your firm, I'd love to just review a couple key points and action items and invite you to share anything else I might have missed. But I think really one of the big things that I took from our conversation is critical for businesses of any size, right? Whether it's 1 or 1,000 employees, you've got to identify and really prioritize those legal risks, and especially identify what are the most critical areas that could impact your business, and develop a plan around that. And part of that plan is mitigating legal risk through compliance, right? And having compliance systems in place to make sure we're adhering to laws and regulations. You talked about, building missiles or government contracts, right? Very different situations. You need to have those right systems in place. And I think, really seeking counsel early and often to avoid issues. And I think it's important, as you've noted, right? There's affordable, cost-effective legal services out there that you can go with without compromising quality. And I think that's really important for a lot of small business owners. And then I think finally, that practical risk-based approach that you talked about, I think is really important. And I think that starts with that partnership and really managing those risks effectively, really getting that tailored guidance for your business, your unique situation is really impactful. So just appreciate all the insights today. So Eric or Scott, anything I missed before we kind of wrap up today's episode?
I think that was a good summary of what we talked about, David. So yeah, no, I think that's good.
He's pretty good at that, isn't he?
Yes. Yes, you must have done this before.
Awesome. Well, hey, as we wrap up, Scott, I'd love to know just a little bit more about kind of Roni business law, anything that anybody should know, anything in particular you want to share with the audience today about kind of what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of go over my background a little bit more, I spent almost 30 years in big business for the most part. I mean, doing a lot of global transactions and a lot of the kind of compliance issues I talked about, investigating different matters. I've probably got a unusually broad experience with different legal issues. So, that's a positive on the one hand. And I think to do what I'm talking about here with being a fractional general counsel, I think that's a really good background. I'm not the guy that if you're getting sued or you got a deep dive into some financial regulation issue, I'm probably not the guy for that. And I'll tell you that if we get in a situation and that's where you are. But I think I do have a good general background in the variety of issues that come up for businesses. And I just have a passion at this point for helping smaller and medium-sized businesses grow and compete and be successful. I've seen the dog-eat-dog world of the big business and how tough it can be sometimes. And I feel for these business owners or executives of businesses that are trying to move up and grow and get into that realm and compete with those kind of businesses. So whatever I can do to help them stay focused on where their expertise is and their best use of their time and their value I'd like to do that.
Awesome. Well, if you're listening or watching, you want to connect with Scott, we're definitely going to have a link in the show notes, but head over to ronibusinesslaw.com, and a lot of great resources and information on the site, and just a great way to learn more. So Scott, it's been great spending some time with you. Eric, I keep prodding Eric, just so you know, Scott, he's got this big announcement coming up and he just refuses to share it with the audience. So maybe today's the day. I don't know. We'll see. But Eric, anything new at My Biz Coaches you want to share with the audience today? Not to put any pressure on you. Right.
Not yet. No, I'll have to reach out to Scott and figure out when the appropriate time for us to release our information. So we don't divulge anything that may cause the deal to go through or not go through. So.
Fair enough. Okay. Worth a shot.
We continue to move forward that plan, that project, and excited about the momentum we're building. Brought on a new coach this week, picked up two new clients, which, by the way, just this quick aside for Scott here, 2 new clients, both lawyers. I don't know how that's happening, but that's working for me.
Well, good.
But I think that as we continue to grow and expand, one of the things that really resonates with our client conversations that I really have come to appreciate is, the reason we went with you or the reason we want to work with you is because you don't force the square peg into the round hole. We realize that coaches have a structure or a process that they need to follow to be consistent. But we're here and we need to be met where we're at. And so that at My Biz Coaches, that's what we intend to do. We meet the client where they're at, as opposed to, hey, I need you to fill out all this. And Scott actually alluded to it earlier. I need you to fill out all this information. And then when you're done with that, then you're going to have this pre-screening phone call with this person. And then you're going to go, and I understand there's a value in that process, but at the same time, if you have a unique problem or question or concern, and we can get into that, and that's where you're at right now, and that's what's keeping you up at night, that's what we want to help solve. We can get into your business and dig in and help you where we need to help you. But consequently, if there's something that's not working in your business and you want to get it solved quickly, typically we can come in and make an impact really quickly. So I just enjoy getting that feedback from new and existing clients, and so I appreciate that, and I just like sharing that. So
awesome. Yeah, thanks, Eric. And last thing, I know we're June, but the year's flying by. You've got an event coming up in a couple months.
Thank you for the reminder.
Talk about that.
Yes. Yeah, we'll lock in that date by the end of June.
Okay.
So, but it is definitely not Halloween weekend. So thank you for the reminder on that, everybody who helped me with that one. But As a matter of fact, I think we're targeting right now the 3rd and 4th of November, based on some other things that have recently come up in the Valley. And yeah, we're excited about that. We're expecting a much bigger turnout. So we had a great turnout last time, even bigger this time, and some unique plays to that. But really excited about that event coming up soon.
Awesome. Oh, great stuff as always. Well, Scott, thanks again. It's been great talking with you. Really appreciate the insights today. And yeah, just thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, awesome.
Absolutely.
Eric, always
Thanks,
good
Scott.
to spend time with you. And for those watching and listening, we'll see you on the next episode. See ya.
Great. Thanks.